Hi, my name is Ethan Life, and I will be refuting the speech by Veronica Hernandez. Her main claim for the speech was that bilingual education is unnecessary. Her secondary supporting claims are bilingual education does not effectively teach students English, students stay in the bilingual education program for too long, and that many parents feel that bilingual education does not help their children. My first issue with the evidence provided by Ms. Hernandez deals with the speech as a whole. Looking over the speech outline, she continues to use information from the early to mid-90s. This data is clearly outdated, and a quick search on an internet search engine will produce more recent data. Believe me, I checked. Another issue I found with the evidence as a whole is that it lacks variety. With the exception of a study conducted in El Paso, Texas, all the statistics come from the New York City and Brooklyn areas. With such a narrow field of evidence, a claim like the one made cannot be made reasonably. Her first piece of evidence for her first claim is that students spend 3 hours a week learning in these bilingual classes, as documented by the ELL Subcommittee Research Studies Progress Report in New York City. Not only does this evidence not say anything towards the claim that it is under, but it also doesn't have a date of the study, leaving it open to interpretation. Her second piece of evidence shows how English immersion classes showed higher success rates than bilingual education. The study was conducted in the early 90s and is outdated and therefore irrelevant. Secondly, this merely shows how there are alternatives, not how the program fails to teach English as a language. Another issue I would like to draw attention to is how she was in the bilingual program in elementary school through middle school. If the program fails to teach students English, how is it that she was able to present her claim in English with a better vocabulary than I have? For her second claim of students staying in the program for too long, she cites a lawsuit made in 1995 against Brooklyn Public Schools. She fails to give a name for this lawsuit to check the validity of the evidence, which looks like she's hiding something. The evidence also deals with the Brooklyn area, an issue I mentioned earlier. Her third claim of parents not wanting children in bilingual education because it does not teach English effectively also has its faults. She has a quote from a parent where the student could not read in either English or Spanish by the 7th grade, even though he was in bilingual classes. I don't know about you, but at this point I would think some responsibility falls upon the parent to teach the children how to read in at least one of the languages. If they can't read the material, how can they learn the material? For her other piece of evidence in this secondary claim, she says that 70% of Mexican parents would want Spanish and English taught in schools, and 12% would have Spanish taught in school if it meant less time for English. She also notes in her introduction that 8% of bilingual education students continue to be taught in that program. That 8% could very well come from the 12% of families that want Spanish taught, therefore leaving less time for English, resulting in the need for more instruction in the bilingual classes. And with 70% of the parents wanting both languages taught, the evidence she presents actually shows how bilingual classes are desired by the parents and fights against her own argument. Overall, the argument that Ms. Hernandez presented has issues with outdated evidence, narrow studies, and evidence that contradicts her own claims. These faults skew the image of the issue at hand for the audience and does not offer the most accurate viewpoint. Bilingual education may not be the greatest program to teach English, but is necessary for those classes to exist for the sake of non-English speaking students.
All right, well, the main and secondary claims are labeled. Most of the arguments that you have are presses on the evidence that the advocate's presenting, and they're reasonable challenges to make. A couple of the points are interesting analytical presses as well. I may have made this comment last week. If I did, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I think it applies here as well. These are the kinds of responses that I think you could give immediately after the argument, having heard it, not necessarily after having done some research on the subject. And to me, it seems like an underdeveloped argument as a consequence consequence. You've got some general criticism of the dates of the research. You've got a criticism about the location of the research. You've got kind of some interesting insight into the way the evidence might be interpreted or what it means, especially when you get into all that statistical material on the second point. But none of, there are no counterclaims. There's no evidence from a point of view different than what the advocate presented. It's just, kind of picking at the evidence. And like I said, they're pretty reasonable presses, but they're not automatically convincing, and any information that added to your argument, I think, would help quite a bit. It's reasonably well structured. I did think when you got to that statistical information that you had there at the end that it just got confusing. I don't know what inference you were trying to draw at the end. So just a little too complicated for an oral presentation there. Or oral presentation to me after I've heard 46 speeches today.